So welcome everyone to my annual beginner seminar, which I run in January every year, or at least for the last, 5 years maybe more. The session itself, if I can get to the right screen, I really want to spend time today just trying to give people a leg up and a start in xLights. I'm deliberately not trying to recover all of the material that I ran over last year. I'm trying this year not to do a sort of a focus on features and capabilities, but this year what I want to do is I want in the first hour start with a bunch of things that you kind of need to know before you start. Things that you need to consider. We'll talk about pixel types and controllers and all of those sorts of things. And then in the second hour, I want to go through, create a layout, create a sequence, and really not try and drill into all the things that you can do. There's plenty of other videos out there where we do those sorts of walkthroughs. And then at the end, I'm happy to hang around and do a Q&A and answer any specific questions people might have. If this is your first time in the xLights Zoom room, this Zoom room is open 24/7. There are people in there. Well, it used to be that, there were just people here on a Wednesday night US time, but over the last couple of years, it's grown to the point that there seems to be people in here 24/7, 365 days a year. And so if you ever find yourself stuck, need some advice, need to talk over a decision or a design thing that you're doing, it can be a great place to come in and talk to other enthusiasts and get ideas and answers. So welcome to the room. So let's get into it. Who am I? My name's Keith Wesley. I'm in Sydney, Australia. I've been an active developer of xLights since late 2014. xLights has been out since 2012. In fact, we're very, very close to our 10-year anniversary, which is coming up in the next few days or weeks. I can't remember the exact date, but Sean does. It's it really it started off as a show player, but its big change was in 2014, early 2014, when it really adopted its current format with the timeline and the ability to drop effects onto models, etc. Prior to that, it was a very, very hard tool to use with spreadsheets and timing and all sorts of complexities. But since 2014, it's had its current form, and it's really changed over that time to become much easier to use. It's not slick, it's not simple, but it's an extremely capable tool and stands head and shoulders above most of the other options that are out there. I also, over the last year or so, have been working with David Pitts at Falcon on the V4 controllers, and I wrote the firmware that runs on those controllers. And I want to mention that because I will talk about controllers and people need to understand potential underlying biases that might be there. I do have a YouTube channel. I will post a link on the video when it goes up onto YouTube, but you can find me, it's under my name, on YouTube, and all of the prior seminars along with a whole bunch of other videos that I've put out are available there. So I tend to go through stuff pretty quickly. This is a really big topic. There's a lot to cover. And so, one of the reasons that I do post it onto YouTube is because you always then have the option of going back and re-watching over sections of it. One of the things that it's always interesting late in the year as you see people get their shows up. You've got the group of people that have spent the bulk of the year getting there and talk about the challenges of getting there and how much time they've invested on it over the year. And then you get the people that show up 2 weeks in November and put a show together in 2 weeks. And it must seem quite hard for each of those groups to understand the other group. The person that spent all year on it has struggled with a whole bunch of things. How the hell does someone get a show up in 2 weeks and still gets it going? And for the person who's done it in 2 weeks, why the hell did it take all year for someone to pull a show together and get it up and going when you can just slap it all up in a couple of weeks and it's not that hard? And for me, a lot of it's about the trade-off that you end up making, and that's around cost, future flexibility, scalability, uniqueness, and the resources that you use, right? Nothing slows you down as much as understanding your options. And today in this first hour, I'm going to spend the time talking to you about your options and the sorts of things that if you want to take this in a considered way and optimize your cost, optimize or minimize the amount of waste, the things that you buy that you subsequently find yourself regretting or needing to replace or upgrade. Today's session is going to kind of give you that understanding of what those options are. But there is always the option of just taking the easy approach, spending more money, potentially wasting more money, but getting something done a lot quicker. So if you're watching this a couple of weeks out of Christmas, you probably want to be taking let's just make the really quick decision. And through this presentation, as I remember it, I will sort of point out where there are, the easy calls to make if you're really not fussed about, trying to optimize the entire package for long-term flexibility. So here are the list of things. I won't talk through them. I am going to outline on each of these topics the sorts of options that you have and the things that you can consider. I'm not going to go through everything in excruciating detail. The challenge with doing that is each one of these topics is, almost all of these topics at least, is an hour-long topic on its own. And there are great videos available on VCS, on videos.xlights.org, and in the X Essentials series that go through each of these topics in quite a level of detail. And there'll be presentations coming up in the Wednesday night calls, which is where the X Essentials presentations are recorded, where many of these topics will without a doubt be covered this year. And I would encourage you, where you need a deeper dive or where you really want to make your final decision, to spend a bit of time and watch those things if you are really looking to optimize your decisions. So we're going to go there. So let's start off with the type of show. There are actually several different types of show, and depending on the type of show that you're putting together, the types of controllers and even the sequencing software, you may want to make different decisions. For some people, and in the early 2000s when people were first going into these types of shows, light displays tended to be traditional. And by traditional, I mean that they used typically AC or lights which run potentially at a lower voltage, but are just strings of lights, and potentially with a multifunctional controller. They're typically LEDs. Some of them, obviously, in the old days, were incandescents. And here you really only have the option of turning them on or off or fading them. You don't really have the multicolours that you get out of pixels. Then you have pixels, and there's two types of pixels. When most people think about pixels, they think about pixels that are individually controllable, where every single light bulb you can set one of many different colors. But there are also what are known as dumb pixels, which are pixels where you can set them to any color, but every light on the string is the same color. And again, they require different types of controllers, and they're nowhere near as popular these days, and the price difference is generally not sufficient that someone would go that way. There are people out there that do video displays, video projection and the like, and then there's also displays, particularly Halloween, where people go in for things like animatronics and the like, etc. And so depending on what type of show you're going on, you're going to need to consider the sorts of things that you do, or the combination of hardware that you're going to go and end up with. These days, and our xLights user base is probably predominantly pixel shows, many pixel only, some hybrid with pixel and traditional. Some do definitely have video in their shows. I think video projection is still not that common. And so while it is possible to do that sort of stuff, it's not common. And animatronics, there are definitely some people out there that integrate some animatronics in with their displays. So sequencing software. So while my background is xLights, etc., I recognise that there are other options out there, and again, recognising the bias that I might have. Let's talk through the three main options. And look, there are other options. I won't talk about things like Madrix and the like, and there are a number of other more commercially orientated lighting platforms like I don't know, I can't remember it. So xLights strength, it's cross-platform. It runs on Windows, OS X and Linux natively on all of those platforms. It's extremely scalable. It can support well over 1 million pixels. And while your render times will suffer as your show gets much, much bigger, the reality is it can handle it, and pretty much nothing else can. It definitely has the largest and most active community between the Facebook groups, the forums, the Zoom room, the initiatives like X Essentials and VCS, which essentially span off from the xLights community, although it does support a broader range of things. All of those things come from a very engaged and active community. It definitely has the largest volume of support resources, whether it's manuals and particularly videos and the like. You definitely have the broadest range of things that you can lean on to help you get up and going. And it's also under very active development. xLights continues to push out 40 plus releases a year with additional capabilities in the software. And so it's not a dead platform. It's not a platform that's in stasis. It's a platform that's in active development and is continuing to look to build and address the changing needs of the environment that we all put together shows, and the capabilities of the hardware that we all want to exploit. Vixen is the other open source sequencer. It is a Windows only piece of software. Look, I personally believe it has a much cleaner and more consistent user interface than xLights. However, capacity-wise, it does max out. I won't put a number on where it maxes out because that has changed over the years, but it definitely can't go to 1 million plus pixels. And development has definitely slowed on that software over the last couple of years. It is still putting out annual releases and the like, but the feature growth, etc., has quite more limited. Yet it definitely has a significant fan base, and a lot of those users really love it and really love the experience that they get through it. And I would encourage people who haven't made a choice yet on their software to definitely consider whether Vixen might be the answer for what they need, as long as they understand whereabouts they might hit their growth pains. Light-O-Rama S5 is probably the other big one. Now, Light-O-Rama is not open source and it's not free. There is a licensing model. The licensing model, it basically changes depending on the scale of show that you're trying to run. They also have add-on packages like Superstar, etc., which, while not required, add to the cost, give you new capabilities, but definitely add to the cost. It is Windows only. Yes, you can run it in emulation mode on OS X, etc., but it's not the same. It is fundamentally Windows software. It definitely does provide the best support for their controllers, and if you're going to go with something like Pixie controllers, particularly Pixie 16s and the like, you will get no better support and ability to drive those controllers than you will get through something like Light-O-Rama S5. It is also under active development. It's probably not quite as active as xLights. It is actually based on xLights, or at least it did take a copy of xLights version 3 a number of years ago, which was folded into the Light-O-Rama software. And so it doesn't really look like xLights, but it has got some commonalities to it. Many of the effects overlap, and there's a number of features which have also have been incorporated into S5. It's not a bad sequencer at all. And like I said, particularly if you're using their hardware, potentially a good option for you. On the controller side, I'm not going to go through all of this. I've kind of tried to pick a number of key capability areas that you might want to consider when you're choosing controllers. All of these controllers will drive pixels. So it's not that any one of these controllers is bad or will not work, but some of them have greater strengths than others that you will need to consider if you're in the market for a new controller and you want to do it. These are all pixel controllers. The capabilities that I've got across the top here, capacity is just, literally how many pixels can these controllers drive. Topology is typically focused on things like the ability to support remotes or spread out your controllers, and I'll talk through how I've rated those. Flexibility is the ability to easily support more difficult to support props and lighting. Ease of use is about just, how easy is it to configure and set up and manage the controllers. Now, look at this from a new user perspective rather than an expert user. I am sure that even the most difficult to set up controller here, if you're very familiar with the controller, it's not hard to use. And that's generally true. But looking at it from a new user perspective, some controllers you're going to find are much easier to walk up and use than others. Pixel support is just the breadth of support for different types of pixels. The show player capability is because some controllers include the ability to actually play your show from the controller. And other capabilities is a grab bag of miscellaneous capabilities, and I'll talk through some of those. So let me loop back around, talk about capacity. So capacity, like I said, is just the pure number of running pixels. Look, the king of the crop here is probably the FPP based controllers, which are built on the BeagleBone base. So where they're built on the Pi, they don't generally run that many pixels at all, but the BeagleBone controllers generally will offer the most amount of pixels, and even on a pixels per dollar basis, you can't really go past the FPPs. The Falcon is very close to it, but not the same. The HinksPix is probably that next tier down in terms of volume of pixels. And then look at the other end of the scale. You've got the WLED and ES pixel stick controllers, which can typically run just a few strings of lights, but they're often Wi-Fi based. And look, I talk about these things as if they're just one controller, but the WLED controllers come in multiple flavors, some with SD cards, some without, some with multiple outputs, some with just one output. And so, look, there is some variation in there, but generally speaking, those controllers are at the low end in terms of the number of pixels that they can run. The Avateks and Pixcons and the like have got fairly low limits, like 340 pixels per output, and the Pixies are even lower, typically around 170. The Alpha Pix is around 340 as well. Topology wise comes down to things like smart remotes or remotes, and this is the ability to take ports and distribute them remotely from the controller. And here the winner in terms of just diverseness of capability, etc., is probably the HinksPix. The HinksPix has got quite a diversity of capabilities here with AC remotes, the ability to have 16 ports on the remotes, etc. There's quite a lot of flexibility there. Closely followed by the Falcon and FPP with their smart remotes and dumb remotes, and the ability to chain these days, depending on the version that you're on, up to 6 of these remotes from the controller. And I gave WLED and ES Pixel Stick an extra point there, etc., just because they're Wi-Fi, and that creates a different topology than most people use. Whereas all the others are, generally speaking, controllers that just control local pixels. On the flexibility front, the Falcons and the FPPs get extra points because of the support of virtual strings, and this enables you to even have different color orders of pixels within the same connected string of lights, which is not possible on most of the other controllers. I gave the least number of points here to the Pixies. And that's because at the end of the day, the Pixies, you really have very limited ability to configure those at all. They're quite, you just plug them in and they are what they are. Ease of use, I think if you're a new user, the simplicity of the controls around the Falcon, the Pixel Stick and the Pixies, just because there's very little that you can set there, generally make those a little bit easier to get into as a new user. WLED, this gets a little murky, but I think WLED with its sort of, it's phone-based, fairly simple user interface. I marked FPP down a little bit here just because, FPP is one of these things which has got everything but the kitchen sink into it, and when you look at the volume of support that's provided for people setting up FPP, etc., I think that complexity sort of undermines it a little bit on the ease of use. Again, if you're familiar with FPP, I'm sure you don't find it difficult. That's fine. But for a new user approaching FPP, it's definitely more complex than most. I gave the AlphaPix a few extra points here because at the end of the day, the AlphaPix is quite a straightforward controller. There's not a lot to configure, so it does make it reasonably easy to use. And the Avitex I marked down here because of the need for this independent configuring program, etc., which makes it all a little bit weird to use. On the Pixel support front, the Avitex and Pixicons, which are fundamentally the same hardware, this wins out here. The Avitec guys support an amazing array of pixels. So if you've got something weird and esoteric that you'd want to use, the Avitec is probably the most likely board to support your weird and wonderful pixels. I think closely following the Avitex is the Falcons. Again, supports a fairly diverse array of pixel types. The Hinx, I believe, I'm a little bit out on a limb here, but I think they support a number of different pixel types as well, as does the AlphaPix. And then most of the others are pretty strictly WS2811s and the various flavors of different pixels, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. On the show player front, FPP stands head and shoulders above everything else. Nothing is as good as a show player as FPP is here. FPP really began its life as a show player and then a pixel controller. That's obviously changed a lot over the years, but it's still an incredibly strong show player and deserves maximum points here. Both the Falcon and Hinxpix can be show players, but the capabilities are significantly more limited than FPP. And to be honest, they can't really drive other controllers the way FPP can. None of the others have any show playing capabilities. And in terms of other capabilities, again, going back to that statement around FPP being, everything but your kitchen sink, it really does have a really diverse capabilities, whether you want to drive panels, whether you want to show video, whether you want to have inputs and scripting. All of that capability sits within FPP. So if those capabilities interest you, they're quite strong. WLED, I gave extra points here because of, WLED is, for people that are just looking for accent lighting through the bulk of the year, the WLED inbuilt effects and the like, etc., really gives it certain capabilities that can be quite attractive. And the only other one I gave some points to there is the Falcon, and really that's only because there are some input pins that you can use to trigger things and the like there, but it's not a material additional capability. So I'm sure lots of people will have different points of view on this, and look, I'm more than happy to discuss it and debate it with people, but that's kind of my lay of the land. Right now, at the beginning of 2022, your biggest challenge is availability. The reality is the bulk of these controllers are dependent upon chips that are in very low supply right now, and so it will be, I would suspect, be patchy supply throughout 2022 on these things. So when you can get access to a controller that you're interested in, I suggest that you go in there and you snap them up. If you've got extra controllers you're looking to get rid of, 2022 is the year to get rid of them, because you're going to make a decent return on them compared to what you might have done in the past. And quite frankly, all of these controllers, including a whole bunch of controllers that I haven't mentioned here, will all run your pixels. And so, there's nothing wrong with J1 sys or something like that. Very old controllers, but they will still run pixels. You can go and grab those. AC and dumb, there's slightly different controllers here, and again, each of these controller providers actually have multiple different types of controllers. There's not a huge amount of difference in capability across these things. It's not like pixel controllers where there's a large amount of diversity. Here, everything largely does the same thing. The Light-O-Rama controllers, they have both DC and AC type controllers. They're probably the Rolls-Royce of controllers. They're very, very well built. They're extensively used, lots of people with familiarity, and a lot of users that come across and start to use pixels and move to xLights come across wanting to continue to use their Light-O-Rama controllers, which they absolutely can do. Pretty much everything they can do, capacity, in terms of number of lights that they can support. These are never high. This is typically 16, 24 channels or thereabouts. Topology wise, Light-O-Rama, you just chain everything together. Flexibility, everything, there's no real difference here. Ease of use, there is some complexity with some of them in setting them up, and we'll talk about those. And light support, generally they all support various types of lights. Renard is a little bit more do-it-yourself alternative to Light-O-Rama. It was a bit of a community initiative a number of years ago, back when Light-O-Rama was quite expensive and people were looking at cheaper options. They're still very good controllers. They're still available, and you should definitely consider those. Pixel 2 Things has been out for a couple of years. The big difference with Pixel 2 Things is they're designed to sit within a stream of pixel data, so you can just plug them into your pixels and have a bunch of AC channels connected up. I did mark them down a little because the capacity is slightly lower, and ease of use wise, inserting AC channels into a stream of pixels, it's not hard to do, but there's definitely some complexities that you need to get around. It's not quite as simple to use as the others. Alan Hansen and Hansen Electronics has a number of AC and DC type options, and if you're in Australia, particularly with some of the lights that we have with where we use a lot of switch mode power supplies and AC, low voltage AC lights, Hansen's got some very interesting boards that are quite capable there. And then there's the HinksPix AC remote, which fits within its remote family. Again, quite capable boards. I've marked them a little bit down again on ease of use for similar reasons to the Pixel 2 Things. They can be a little bit quirky to set up and get configured and up and going in xLights, but quite capable boards in terms of driving AC lights. Topology. Let's talk about topology and some things that you need to make decisions around here. By far, probably the biggest decision that people will want to make is things like, well, do I have boards with all of the controllers with all of the pixel ports locally, or do I want to work with these smart remote or dumb remote boards and distribute my pixel ports out around my property on the end of Cat5 cables? These topologies typically allow you to locate your ports as much as 300 feet away from your controller. And so here we're talking about things like the HinksPix, the Falcon 48s or the Falcon 16s with expansion boards, or most of the FPP controllers support these as well. They can be really good if you've got a property that's very large and you need ports distributed all the way around. I do personally believe that people buy more Falcon 48s than they really should do. I really do think that most displays would be better served by a core controller with local ports and then some smart remotes, and many boards will support hybrids where you have some local ports but also some remote ports, and I really think that probably makes sense for most people's displays. But if you've got a really large display or just a really spread out display, these things can be a really good idea to take advantage of. The dumb versus smart remotes. Dumb remotes basically allow you to have the pixels pushed out to this remote, but all the pixels on a particular port are on that dumb remote, whereas smart remotes allow you to chain the remotes together. So you can run the data out to one remote, and then you can daisy chain another remote and then another remote. Now, there is a lot of complexity here as it relates to how these remotes impact on your pixel port capabilities. You know, controllers will talk about, I can run 680 pixels off a port or 1024 pixels off a port. Adding these remotes generally subdivides that pixel capacity up across the remotes. And so you really want to spend a bit of time digging into and understanding how these remotes interplay with your controller and how it might undermine or impact on the number of pixels that you can run in your layout. I think too many people sort of gloss over this and don't spend enough time understanding how this works, and then suffer later as they start to realize that actually they can't do everything that they wanted to do because they didn't really understand how all of these things play together. Now, there are some good spreadsheets out there that for various controllers that begin to try and let you model how your controllers are going to work. The other good thing to use is xLights and the visualizer. You can create the controller, start to put all of your props onto the controller and configure it up. And xLights is very aware of the constraints and limitations of these controllers and will start to give you warnings when you start to cross over various thresholds, etc. So, yeah. The other thing about smart remotes, and we definitely saw this through the past Christmas seasons, is that remotes are generally introduce additional complexities when it comes to troubleshooting. And while there are capabilities to test on remotes and you know, things like the Falcon V4 has some specific test modes that try to make testing smart remotes a little bit easier, the reality is there is more that can go wrong. And people do experience that, and some of those problems can be extremely difficult to troubleshoot. And I definitely saw a few situations during the past Christmas season where, you know, people struggled for quite some time to resolve certain types of issues on remotes. You know, they are definitely not for the faint heart. So if you don't need to use them, I would not use them. And I definitely, again, I'd still think too many people use things like Falcon 48s when a local controller with local ports with a few remotes would be a much better choice for them. Pixels. So let's talk about pixels. I talked a little bit about smart versus dumb. Smart pixels, every pixel can change color independently. Dumb, you change all of the pixels on the string to the same color at the same time. They require quite different controllers. Dumb pixels require specifically dumb controllers. In this day and age, in 2022, I do not know why anyone would buy dumb pixels. Be very careful if you're going to buy pixels and you see that the pixels have 4 wires. While there are smart pixels which have 4 wires, often the 4 wire pixels are dumb pixels, and I've seen people buy these thinking they're getting a great deal on smart pixels only to realize that they ended up with a bunch of dumb pixels that they can't do anything with. I would generally recommend people stick with smart pixels. Pixel protocol is definitely something that you want to consider. The vast majority of people use pixels based on the WS2811 protocol, and you know, this is a page that actually comes from the Falcon controller. The reality is there's actually a huge number of different types of pixels out there which all talk the same WS2811 protocol. And so WS2812, 2813, 2815, 2818, they all are WS2811 protocol pixels. But so are the US 1903s, the APA 104s, the SK6812 RGB pixels. They all talk the WS2811 protocol. This is the most widely supported protocol across the controllers. They all support this protocol. And quite frankly, you know, unless you're after something very specific out of a different protocol, I would recommend people stick with pixels based on these chipsets. There's really little reason to go there. But look, there are other protocols out there, TLS 3001. If you're going to go with RGBW pixels, there are slightly different protocols for those as well. There's also a number of clocked pixel protocols, which in theory allow you to run your pixels faster and things like that. But they're all quite esoteric, and when you come back to the community and you're looking for support, people don't even ask whether you're not running WS2811 because everyone assumes that you are. 12 volts versus 5 volts, the perennial debate on which one you should use. The reality is that 5 volts, you can run more 5 volt pixels off a power supply than you can run 12 volts, but you can't run them as far. 5 volts is generally quite good for really dense pixels, but you need to inject power or provide power to the pixels more often with 5 volts. And that's why on dense props, 5 volts can make some sense. Definitely allows you to run a more dense props with less power supplies, and this is why if you're going to go out there and buy P10 panels or P5 panels, they all run at 5 volts. Now 12 volts will give you distance. You can run 12 volts a lot further and still get a good voltage and drive your lights. So if you're doing house outlines, if you're running lights out along a fence, if you're running lights out to a bunch of mini trees at the front of your property and it's 30, 40, 50, 90 feet away from the house, you'd be mad not to use 12 volts. Okay? Now, there are a lot of people that like to stick to a single voltage, and consequently they tend to stick with 12 volts, and they just suck up the fact that they're not going to get as much efficiency out of the power supplies, but they get the flexibility of them. So, and that's why 12 volts, generally speaking, is more popular than 5 volts, but there's definitely people out there that run a whole mixture of things. Now, in terms of protocol, I did a bunch of testing a couple of years ago in a VCS presentation where I looked at signal integrity, etc. You get slightly less signal distance out of 12 volt pixels, and you may find that you need to take a look at signal boosters like F amps or U amps and the like, which boost the signal, which you might need if you're running 12 volts over a long distance in order to keep your signal integrity up and drive the pixels. If you are going 12 volts, you then have got the additional complexity of choosing whether you want to go with regulated versus resistor pixels. To be honest, it is much of a muchness. You'll get slightly better color for further using regulated pixels than you will with resistive pixels. I think it's fair to say that the bulk of the negative experiences that people have had with the failure of pixels, regulated pixels, seem to be a bigger problem space there. I don't think it's inherent to the fact that they're regulated. They are slightly more complex. There's more components in them. They're potentially a little bit more expensive, but quite frankly, I think what's more important is the integrity of the gel or the epoxy that fills the pixels up and their ability to keep water out of the pixels. To me, that's the biggest correlator to failure of pixels than whether it's regulated or resistor or anything else. RGB versus RGBW, the vast majority of people use RGB. There are some people that do like RGBW pixels. I think we see it a little bit more commonly in people that potentially want to do permanent light mounting, and they want to have that pure white when when they want to turn their lights on white. It's definitely a lot less common. The support in the software is there, but it's definitely not as well understood. And it's more fiddly. Controllers are also a problem. Not all controllers support RGBW pixels. Again, rarer. Clocked pixels, I talked briefly about that. So these are 4-wire pixels where they've got this extra wire, which is a clock signal. Generally speaking, I recommend you stay away from them, not because they're bad or anything else, but many of the controllers do not support clocked pixels. And so, if you're going with any of the FPP based controllers, none of them will support clocked pixels. You'll have to go with an Avatec or a Falcon, or I think the AlphaPixels also support clocked pixels. They're not as rare, not as common, and to be honest, you don't really get the benefits that clocked pixels could offer, because the controllers don't generally support it, and that is you can in theory run clock pixels faster and get higher frame rates, but most of the controllers don't support them, other than maybe the Avitec, which do drive very high frame rates. Be very careful about spacing. When you go and you buy pixels, particularly you pick a no-name vendor on Amazon, be very wary of the spacing that you're buying and how they're measuring the spacing. For a lot of people, the spacing is the length of the wire, and that includes, you know, the wire, the part of the wire that's soldered onto the board inside the pixel. So a 3-inch pixel does not give you 3 inches separation of those pixels center to center. Generally speaking, I would add an inch in spacing to whatever it is that you think you need when you measure the center gaps that on your prop that you're mounting your pixels on. So if your prop centers need to be at least 3 inches, I would buy 4-inch spacing to give you that little bit of extra space. Now, it does vary by supplier, it even varies by batch. So yeah, don't get yourself caught short. This is a really common way in which super cheap pixels save money, is by providing spacing, which is not as much as you might expect. Wire gauge is another thing to be wary of, particularly when it comes to cheap pixels. Another way in which they save money and are able to offer you those pixels cheaper is to skimp on the wire gauge. And Chinese wire gauges are not the standard wire gauge. When something says it's 20 or 18 AWG, it is not 20 AWG, it's 22 or 24 at best. Right, so don't let yourself get fooled, and don't skimp on the wire gauge. Wire gauge has a really significant impact on how many pixels you can connect together before you start to run into power issues. So be really wary of those. Power supplies, look, you know, to be honest, I don't think this is a really big deal. You know, Meanwell is probably the best power supplies out there you can buy. You know, if you find yourself in overpower situations or failure situations, the Meanwells are the most likely ones to handle that well. The HP power supplies have become popular. These are old server power supplies which are often sold second-hand, and you can buy breakout boards which slide in onto the edge connector and provide a way to break the power out to the props. They've become quite popular. You tend to get a lot more power out of a HP power supply. They tend to be about double what your Meanwells are. Your Meanwells are typically about 350 watts, and your HPs are getting up around your 700 or more. And so they have become popular there, although the form factor can be a little difficult because of the size. And then there's the Chinese power supplies, also 350 watts. Generally speaking, they're pretty good. They work just fine. Just a little bit more concerning when it comes to failure situations and how they fail, etc. But look, there has, even over the last few years, you know, I've seen people have failed power supplies, but I don't think we've seen, you know, fires or other significant events as a result of failed power supplies. They've all gone reasonably well. Power injection. Look, one of the key decisions I see some users make early on is whether they do or don't want to do power injection. Power injection can be fiddly, can be a little bit nerve-wracking for people, and there's definitely a group of users out there who choose to spend a little bit more, buy a few more controllers or a few more remotes, etc., in order to avoid the need to use power injection. And I get it, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, you can run every arch on an individual output and avoid any power injection at all if that's what you want to do. If you've got a mega tree, you can run every string of lights on that mega tree on its own output. Have no issues with that. It will work. You'll spend a lot more money on controllers in doing so, but that's okay if you're going to avoid something that you'd really like to avoid. That said, there's a lot of people that also like to maximize the utilization of the ports on their controllers. The Falcon controller supports 1024 pixels, and come hell or high water, they want to be using the bulk of those, and they'll join a whole bunch of lights together, and in doing that they will need to power inject. It's just a question of how often, etc. A lot of users will use brightness to control power consumption. So by default, if you run lights at 100%, generally speaking, with 5-volt pixels, you should inject every 50 pixels, and with 12-volt pixels, you should inject with every 100. Now you can stretch it, and you can do things like, you know, run 200 pixels, inject at the beginning, inject at 200, and maybe you can run another 100 after that and still get it. So you can get away with 2 power injection points for 300 pixels. There's a number of videos that go through this in enormous detail, and if you're going to do power injection, I strongly suggest you invest your time in watching some of those videos and really getting an appreciation for how power injection works and what the best injection points are on a prop. But a lot of people do reduce brightness in order to reduce power consumption, and you know, you hear of people that are running 300 or 400 12-volt pixels with 0 power injection. It can work. It's up to you. It's really a personal choice around whether you want to adopt that sort of approach. You do need to think about failure scenarios and what happens if the controller suddenly outputs at 100% instead of at 30%. What's going to happen? I can assure you none of the controller vendors are warranting that they guarantee that they will never output at 100% brightness. It doesn't mean that they will output a greater than the brightness, but they're not warranting anything there. You know, this is a risk that you're taking. You can definitely bypass your controller. You definitely cannot run 1,000 pixels off a controller, pulling all of your power through the controller ports. They're just not designed for that. They typically have 5 amp or 3 amp fuses there. If you're going to inject or run more pixels, you're going to have to inject that power by bypassing your controller and taking the power directly from your power supplies. There's also a number of different topologies when it comes to power injections. You can do things like, I'll do this, I might have a string of arches and I'll run my power to the first arch and the first prop, and then the power will go through the arch and through all of the pixels, but I'll also bypass the pixels and run a power lead that goes from the first pixel to the last pixel on the arch, and that provides a lower resistance path to get the power into the second arch. It doesn't have to go through all of the pixels in the first arch. So that's one type of topology that you can use for power injection. You can also go back to the supply, so you can run another wire all the way back to the power supply to inject power into the second arch. Now you wouldn't do that for an arch because the power drop would not be enough, but you might do that after the 4th arch or the 5th arch. Just run a wire all the way back to the power supply to provide a fresh run of power to the props. And there is also topologies where you use multiple supplies, so multiple power supplies. So if you're running a mega tree with 32 strands of 112 volt pixels, you're not going to run that off a single power supply, although you might run individual strings off a single power supply. But if you are going to run one string of lights off multiple power supplies, you do need to be very careful not to join the positive rails together from the 2 power supplies. And again, I refer you to those detailed presentations which talk through this in an enormous amount of detail to make sure that you understand what you're doing before you do it. Power supplies do not like to have their power positives connected together. John Spiker at xLights, he's got a whole bunch of stuff on power injection. He's got videos where he's tested various failures. He's got a calculator which helps you understand how power will flow along your pixels. If you really want to get into it, there's probably no better resource than John and the work that he's done around power injection. Connectors, look, these days the vast majority of people go with X-Connect. Not because the others don't work, but the X-Connect connectors just seem to go together better. They work across a number of different suppliers. They work with the Holiday Coro connectors, and so they've just become pretty much the de facto standard. And if you're new to the hobby, I would struggle to recommend anything else. But look, there are Ray Wu and Paul Zhang connectors out there, and lots of people use those as well. If you're buying the lights for cheap on Alibaba or Amazon, they'll often come with a JST connector, which is this flimsy little 3-wire connector. it's not a great connector, but you know, at a push it will also work. I have a number of them that I run outdoors and have run outdoors for a number of years, and look, they work just fine as long as you're not unplugging them and plugging them in all the time. You know, they just seem to work, but they're not waterproof, and I definitely wouldn't recommend them as a way to do a quality show. And then there's other connectors. I've seen people use automotive connectors and other low voltage connectors. Look, as long as the wire is connected, there's really not a problem. It will work. It's just that, you know, these days, if you're new to the hobby, most people are doing X Connect, and I see little reason to recommend anything else. Prop style, so you need to make choices about how you build your props, and probably the most common ways are these. Conduit's extremely popular, whether it's EMT or plastic conduit. People will either cable tie pixels to it, drill holes through it and push pixels through it. Commonly used for window frames, house outlines, things like that. Some people will also build arches out of that sort of stuff. It's quite common. Coroplast is also very, very common, and you've got vendors like Boscoyo, EFL, GE, Holiday Coro, that will all sell you pretty much any shape that you could imagine in Coro, and then you take your pixels and you push it into it. I would definitely suggest checking those vendors out and seeing the sorts of things. Look, the only downside to Coro, in my opinion, is that it can be a bit of an eyesore. And while a number of these vendors now have printed props where they screen print or inkjet print the props in order to make them look better in daytime, at the end of the day, they are large sheets of plastic that you're putting on your house. They also have the ABS plastic strips and house outlines and things like that. So definitely check out their range of services. Wireframes are also a popular way to build things, and whether it's repurposing a wireframe that maybe had AC lights on it from the past, or it's sourcing new wireframes, can be a popular way to build props. Then there's megatrees, and megatrees are a topic all unto themselves. And again, I would refer you to both VCS and X Essentials that have had a number of presentations about building megatrees. Every year we see people's megatrees fall in a heap on the ground due to weather and build errors, all of which have been covered in these videos talking about what you need to do and how to avoid those sorts of failures. If you're building a new megatree this year, go and watch those videos and understand how to engineer. You don't have to spend a huge amount of money to build a megatree, but there are a whole bunch of really common errors that you can make that lead to megatrees failing. LDPE hose, also down here at least it's known as air cedar hose, is this translucent plastic hose that is really popular for things like leaping arches and things like that. And then of course custom, you know, and I would strongly encourage people to, you know, not just build what everyone else has built, but actually, you know, put something unique in your show, something that you uniquely design. And xLights will support all of those sorts of props and more. When it comes to show players, this is a decision that you generally don't need to make early in the thing. You can make this later in the year if you want to, but the big choices here are to use FPP, probably by a factor of 60 to 70% would be my best guess. A proportion of shows these days run using a Falcon Pi player type show player, whether it's a standalone show player on FPP or it's a controller / show player. They're very, very common. Probably the next most common is xSchedule, which would run on typically on a PC. You know, if you're running some of the controllers, things like Pixies and the like, which, you know, again, I would not recommend, but if you are running Pixies, then you basically have to use xSchedule because FPP doesn't support the Pixie protocol. So you don't have a lot of option there, but there are other reasons why people also choose to use xSchedule. And then, you know, like I said, the Hinkspiks and the Falcons do have a show player built in. I suspect less than 5%, potentially substantially less than 5%. of users would be using something like a Hinks or a Falcon as their show player. The capabilities there are definitely significantly more limited. Where to go for information? Look, you can't go past things like X Essentials. The VCS YouTube channel has a huge array of presentations, not just on covering xLights, but all sorts of things. Can a Spade of Christmas is a really good introduction. There's also Learn Christmas Lighting. He's another guy that's got a whole bunch of beginner videos. I think he does a great job when it comes to most things, like, you know, pixels and controllers and all that sort of stuff. I'm not as impressed on his xLights content. It tends to be a little bit all over the place, whereas Can a Spade tends to do a bit better job there. The official xLights support group on Facebook is probably ground zero when it comes to the community. There's well over 20,000 people in that Facebook group these days, and a very active place to get questions answered. There is the xLights Zoom room, particularly from about September through to the middle of December. It is just wall to wall getting people's shows up and running. And if you have an issue and you haven't tried the xLights Zoom room, then you really haven't tried to get your issue fixed, because those guys are just amazing. And what they can't fix, they generally have the hooks into the people who can step in and get you up and going. There's very few situations that I've seen that they had to walk away from a problem because they just couldn't get to the bottom of it. There are the old web forums, Oz Christmas Lighting, the Nutcracker forum, which is the old xLights forum, Do It Yourself Christmas, DIY Christmas. All of those forums are still out there. They're nowhere near as active as they used to be, but there's still some great content on those forums. And, you know, particularly if you're using Vixen, you definitely want to check out the latter two, because those two are really where the bulk of the Vixen guys are hanging out. The Oz Christmas Lighting Forum is awesome for those guys in Australia and New Zealand. It also happens to be the home of the 101 Christmas Lighting Manual, and if you're new to the hobby and you haven't downloaded that manual and had a flick through it, you know, you're really missing a really great resource for getting up and going with lighting. And then there's a bunch of regional lighting groups. Most of these regional lighting groups have Facebook pages, and they would run a mini, typically one a year. A mini is a mini conference. It will typically run for a day, sometimes 2 days, where local enthusiasts will get together and run demos, do presentations, share stuff. And you really want to get yourself involved in your local regional lighting group. If you go to the official xLights group, one of the pinned posts is Ed's post, which consists of a list of all of the regional groups that we're aware of. If you've got a regional group that's not on that list and you'd like to get on that list, either let me or Ed know, and we'll make sure that you get on there. As they set up their minis this year, very few of them have announced dates yet, but as they have published their dates, they will get their dates up on there as well. Generally speaking, most minis are held from April until about July. So that's when you want to look out for those minis. The only thing I would say, when you start going and looking for information, beware of experts that want to lock you into only one source of information. Almost everything, as you've seen as I've gone through these things, there are valid options, and there are reasons why you would choose one thing over the other. And you really want to make sure that whoever is advising you is making you aware of what your options are and why you're making choices. There's a whole bunch of people with agendas, and that's why I declared my alignment up front, is so that you can sit there and say, well, I understand where he's coming from and potentially what biases that he may have. You need to be sure that you're aware of what other biases people might have. I've seen way too many people advise people to, ditch this controller, move to this, do that, etc., without really seeking to understand the particular situation that someone is in. There is absolutely nothing wrong with a J1 sys controller. It will run the pixels as much as anything else will. I didn't talk about it today because, quite frankly, they're not being marketed anymore. You can only buy them secondhand. But that doesn't make them fundamentally bad, and you shouldn't feel pressured to get off them unless you fundamentally got a good reason to do so, or you need a capability that one of the newer controllers might offer. Reference materials, I talked about the ACL 101 manual. Jump onto, where'd it go? If you jump onto the ACL group, you can download the manual here and take a read of it. Definitely suggest that is worthwhile. The xLights has a manual. If you go to xlights.org, you can download the manual. It's not 100% up to date, but there's a huge amount of effort that Scott and a number of others have put into that manual to try and provide a written set of reference for people that really need it. The xLights video site is a site where we've tried to collect together, and we encourage people to submit additional videos that they might come across that have relevance to the community. That is not a site where we're pushing particular videos. We're really just trying to coalesce the links to the videos that are available on a whole bunch of different sites. And then there's obviously xLights.org. There's a bunch of Facebook groups. Falcon Pi Player has its own Facebook group. xLights obviously does. So strongly encourage you to check those out as well. I think I'm done, at least on that part of the presentation.